everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today, oh boy, do we have a penultimate race to recap. This season has been completely bonkers, if we're being honest, and where we started at the beginning of the year to where we have ended up just with one race weekend left is so beyond what I think anyone could have really truly predicted, and I am so excited that we're actually at this point. Frankly, I really think this season started out in the same way that we had last season, where you thought one team was going to be so dominant, but by the time we have gotten to the end of this season, when we talk about the Drivers' Championship, we have watched McLaren, that dominant team that did win the Constructors' Championship back-to-back, objectively completely throw things away. But if you're new here, just a quick rundown of how things work on this podcast. Generally, we start with things that you may have missed heading into this race weekend to set the scene, and things that are important to know as we go into the race weekend for that context. Then we'll go through free practice, the sprint, and qualifying, and then we'll go through the race itself, as well as the implications for the final race weekend of the season. We always end on any questions or hot takes and predictions that you sent in, and if this is the first time that you're listening and you want to be able to include your hot takes, predictions, and questions in next week's episode, make sure that you are following me on all social media platforms, because that is where you can send them in ahead of the race. And this is a pretty intense weekend that we are recapping, so let's go ahead and just dive right in. However, first and foremost, I do want to acknowledge that if you're watching this on YouTube, we do have a very different background than we normally do, and so for those of you who are just listening, I want to set the scene. There is a giant blanket of Max Verstappen sitting behind me on this wall. You can see it if you watch the YouTube version of this podcast. And frankly, it is something that I will be curled up underneath while we watch the rest of this season. I actually got this in a gift bag in Vegas at the TikTok Creator Clubhouse, and I'm obsessed with it. It came with a matching tote bag and scarf, so I'm the happiest I've ever been. Okay, so heading into this race weekend, it's incredibly important to know that Lando Norris actually had a chance to close out this title. Had he won the Grand Prix today, he would have closed out the championship entirely, becoming a World Drivers' Champion for the first time in his career. And if he had simply finished ahead of Max, he would have put Max out of title contention heading into the final championship round. Obviously, none of those things happened, but it is how we started the weekend out. Max is obviously coming off of a win in Las Vegas, and of course, we also know that the McLarens are in this weird headspace coming off of a double DSQ in Vegas. Now, one of the pieces of media that I think was the most important coming into this race weekend was actually an interview that Max did. In this interview, he was asked about whether or not he thinks he's going to win a championship, what that means to him, and objectively, long story short on that interview, he essentially was like, 4 is nice, 5 is better, but it won't change my life. And he reiterated that he doesn't feel a need to fight for 7 championships just to be able to have that number, and that he has other things that he wants to accomplish outside of Formula One, including racing in other series, as well as spending more time with his family. He also, of course, did say that he would want to win the 5th championship if it works out, but that he wanted to acknowledge that the reason he's still in this championship fight is not because of Red Bull being incredibly successful, but because of the failure of others. In that interview, he did not specifically say the failures of McLaren, but it was heavily implied. And I think that that interview is probably the most well-rounded summation of this season. There is quite literally no reason we should still be in a championship conversation 3 ways between Max, Lando, and Oscar. And there's certainly no reason why one of those McLarens should be behind Max. Something that I think really puts this entire season into context is that after Zandvoort, Max was 104 points behind Oscar Piastri, who at that point led the championship. And now, as we head into the final round of this season, he has not only caught back up, he has surpassed Oscar Piastri and is only 12 points behind Lando Norris. And while we can always say that it's Max and he's always going to be a championship hunter, Oscar and Lando had such a lead that there never should have been a chance for him to catch up. And the only reason he has been able to do so is because of those failures that he referenced. And this weekend is, of course, another one of those failures. And of course, one of those failures that is also making this a lot tighter is that double DSQ that we had last weekend. We did see this sort of odd statement from Zach Brown early on in this race weekend, saying that he said that the FIA was going to reconsider the draconian punishment that they handed out last weekend, referencing that double DSQ of both of the McLaren cars after they had plankwear issues. The thing that was very odd to me about this statement is that it is one of those like hard and fast rules that absolutely happens every single time. There is no real leeway on this type of actual issue. When we talk about plankwear, it essentially just means that your car was running too low to the ground, which is a definite advantage. And both McLarens were found to be underneath that requirement when it comes to that plank. And so when the plank measurement fails, there is no other option. There's no like penalty that you can take that isn't a disqualification. And it's a disqualification that has set a precedent across multiple years of this sport, including this season. Very famously in 2023, there was the double DSQ of Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc from the podium in Coda. We've also had that same disqualification for other teams this season. So I'm not really sure why Zach was saying that it was going to be reconsidered, though he did say it. And I think it does kind of highlight this energy that they're coming into this race weekend with, where there seems to be a sort of lack of desire to really accept the parts that they've done wrong in this championship. And I think like objectively, this disqualification that they faced last weekend was something that they could have fixed. Generally speaking, especially with Lando's radio messages towards the end of the race, we know that they knew that they were getting into that issue. Obviously, there's nothing they could have done during the race itself, but there could have been a change made in the setup when they realized they were taking that risk. And this was a really bad risk to take when we're this close to the end of the championship and you just go through an entire race with no points whatsoever. So outside of media day and statements being made, the other really important thing going into this race weekend was Pirelli, the tire supplier for Formula One, setting a maximum number of laps that drivers would be allowed to make on a single set of tires. This weekend, it was a 25 lap maximum for any set of tires for every driver, and those laps are counted across sessions, meaning that this was a mandated two-stop race. The Qatar Grand Prix is 57 laps, and obviously 25 plus 25 is 50, and then you've got 7 laps left. So coming into this race weekend, tire management was going to be incredibly important, not just for the race itself, but for all of the sessions that come before to make sure that you had the tire allocation that you needed. And it's always important to acknowledge that in a sprint race weekend, everyone has less time across the board. So if you're new to Formula One, on a normal race weekend, we have 3 practice sessions, qualifying, and the Grand Prix itself. On a sprint race weekend, we actually replace 2 of those practice sessions with sprint qualifying and the sprint race. Sprint qualifying is shorter than qualifying sessions, and the sprint race is just a shortened version of the same Grand Prix that we run on Sunday. The Qatar sprint was only 19 laps compared to the 57 that we run for the Grand Prix itself. And so as we go through the weekend, sometimes you'll see that drivers end up having to use sprint qualifying and the sprint race itself as data collection for the Grand Prix to hopefully make some adjustments. And this weekend started out pretty incredible for Oscar, but it also highlighted the worst season that I think Lewis Hamilton has ever had. So let's get into sprint qualifying. Heading into sprint qualifying, Oscar Piastri had been topping the timesheets when it came to free practice. And frankly, until the Grand Prix itself, this was a massive return to form for Oscar. From the very beginning of the weekend, he was hooked up, he was locked in, and frankly, probably the best driver on track. It almost seemed like there was a moment where someone told him, hey, you know, Lando can actually win everything and just end the championship today. And he said, just not today, at least not today. I think there was this element of Oscar waking back up that felt really refreshing and exciting, and also just clear that even if he didn't win the championship, he wasn't going down without a fight. When we look at tires here, everyone put on mediums to start for SQ1. As much as this weekend is so much about the Drivers' Championship, I would be remiss if I didn't mention in the very beginning of sprint qualifying that this was yet another weekend where things are just falling apart for Lewis Hamilton. And I think it's gotten past the point where it's hard to watch. I think we are at this level where it almost is starting to feel like buyer's remorse of him making this move, and almost at this point where you genuinely wonder if Ferrari and Lewis Hamilton are a pair that makes any sense. Because frankly, in my heart, in my belief, I do think Lewis Hamilton still has championship drives left in him. I think he could win a championship. I think he could at least win more races. And I think he for sure should be standing on podiums still. But it feels like this situation where, maybe highlighted by the fact that the president said he wanted their drivers to stop talking and drive more, or the fact that we're hearing these rumors that Lewis is trying to give input and not kind of being welcomed into that space, and genuinely just the way that Charles Leclerc is feeling in this space as well, as someone who's been a part of this team for so long and the face of this team for so long. It feels like Ferrari is just not the right place for someone who wants to win a championship unless things change soon. And watching Lewis be eliminated in SQ1 and then continuing on to maybe one of the worst weekends we've watched in a long time, even after making changes to the car, adding this extra downforce in terms of the rear wing, nothing is working over there, and it's getting to a level where even watching his press is kind of it's just painful. We do know that as early as April of this year, it seems like Ferrari stopped focusing on developing the 2025 car, which could explain some of the performance issues, and hopefully spending that much time moving towards the 2026 car is a positive, but it also feels like it probably isn't. It feels like there may be this level of just like not anything gelling, and it just feels like fundamentally something is wrong over at Ferrari, and it's getting difficult to watch a driver at the caliber of Lewis Hamilton be so despondent when it comes to actually speaking to the media, when it comes to looking at his results, and when it comes to kind of like finishing out a race season. Lewis has said that he is not excited about next season, he's not happy with this season, and he doesn't look forward to pretty much anything. At one point this weekend, we literally heard him comment on the weather being nice as a positive. And so I do wonder if moving to Ferrari was the right move. And frankly, if Charles Leclerc should potentially leave Ferrari as well if he wants to consider winning a championship. Either that or things really have to change, and I think to change them, they really have to take input from new places. So I don't know what 2026 looks like for a Ferrari, but I do know that watching the rest of 2025 is just genuinely painful. In SQ1, we also lose Lance Stroll, Liam Lawson, Pierre Gasly, Gasly and Franco Colapinto. It also feels important to recognize that Liam Lawson, Isaac Hadjar, and Yuki Tsunoda are all kind of up in the air, and we've been told that soon we should hear what the driver lineup is across both teams for next year, but losing Liam Lawson in SQ1 does sort of set the stage for a head-to-head comparison between him and Yuki Tsunoda. Our expectation across the board, rumors-wise, and just sort of understanding the way that this team works, is that Isaac Hadjar will likely be promoted next year to be Max Verstappen's teammate. And then the question is what happens over at VCARB, because Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda are both up for seats, and we most likely are going to see a Red Bull Junior, Arvid Lindblad, actually promoted into that team. As of recording this, we have not heard that announcement, but I am sure based on the way the universe works, as soon as I hit publish on this podcast, the answer will come out. So if you're listening and you're like, we already know the answer to that, I could not wait any longer for Laurent to answer my question, and so here we are. At the end of SQ2, we lose Isaac Hadjar, Ollie Behrman, Gabriel Bortoleto, Nico Hulkenberg, and Esteban Ocon. And then in SQ3, we have a couple of pretty big surprises. One thing that's not a surprise is that Oscar Piastri takes pole after having a pretty dominant session. George Russell then splits the McLarens, taking second, and Lando Norris is in third, giving Oscar a little bit of a healthy gap to start this weekend out in terms of how much he needs to outscore his teammate. And then a couple of big surprises. Fernando Alonso takes fourth position, and Yuki Tsunoda outqualifies Max Verstappen for the very first time, taking fifth and putting Max in sixth. I was so excited about this actually because I really do love Yuki, and I will be really heavily disappointed to see him leave the sport if that is what happens in terms of this driver shakeup. I think Yuki has had sort of the shorthand when it comes to this season. He was doing pretty well at VCARB, and then he had this quick promotion to Red Bull, where we then find out that he's been not given the same amount of setup that Max was given, where car parts and upgrades were being held and not given to Yuki in case they might need them for Max's car, and where this second car that Yuki was in for a lot of this season until we saw a leadership change with Laurent coming in was really just to be filling a seat. And I think with Laurent coming in and changing things, we've gotten a glimpse of what Yuki is potentially capable of, but we haven't gotten a real full season of Yuki and what he could be doing. And I think when you start the season out with such chaos, it can be difficult to come back. And there's a world where Yuki has a really strong performance in him, and I just feel like we're not getting a chance to see that. And we got to see that a little bit from sprint qualifying. Rounding out the rest of the top 10, we had Kimi Antonelli in 7th, right behind Max, Carlos Sainz behind him, Charles Leclerc dragging the Ferrari into 9th position, and Alex Albon bringing the second Williams into 10th, making sure that both of them made it to SQ3. Now, the sprint race itself was objectively kind of boring, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. I think when we look at it, we saw the front of the championship really fighting for points and trying to make moves, and then in the back, we actually saw a couple of teams really just try to get some more data. Once they realized they were out of the points, it was really about trying to figure out how much data they could get for the rest of the weekend. That's why we saw Pierre Gasly and Franco Colapinto pit, even though it is normally not something that you would do in a sprint race, getting a couple of laps on the soft tires to get data that they weren't able to get given the fact that they lost those free practice sessions. But the star of this sprint race is obviously Oscar Piastri. He comes from pole and he wins and dominates this race. We do also see track limits violations coming into a sticky point here, and those unfortunately catch both Yuki Tsunoda and Kimi Antonelli out in the end. Luckily for Yuki, we did see Kimi Antonelli behind him have the same penalty, so he maintains his 5th position, as both he and Kimi received the same penalty for the same track limits violation. Though I do think track limits were a pretty big portion of this weekend, and if you're new to Formula One, track limits is actually pretty simple, but isn't always often explained on the broadcast. So essentially on the racetrack, you see these white lines on the border on either side of the track, and drivers are required to make sure that at no point all 4 wheels go over that white boundary. If they do, it is called a track limits violation. When you violate track limits in practice, your lap time is deleted, but that's pretty inconsequential. But the same thing happens in sprint qualifying or qualifying. So if you actually violate track limits on your lap, that lap that you did is then deleted and not considered towards qualifying, and can catch you out in terms of making sure that you qualify properly for the race itself. However, in a race sequence, whether that's a sprint or a Grand Prix, you actually can violate track limits a couple of times. When you see a notification say that a driver has been given a black and white flag for track limits, it's warning them that if they go over track limits one more time, they will receive a time penalty. And so we saw both Yuki Tsunoda and Kimi Antonelli get that black and white flag during the sprint race, and ultimately they both violated track limits one more time and received that time penalty. Outside of the Drivers' Championship, this sprint race did have a couple of other consequences which were important, one of which being that Fernando Alonso managing to score 2 points in this sprint race did actually launch Aston Martin over Haas in the Constructors' Championship, which is worth millions of dollars. Again, if you're new to Formula One, you may not realize that the Constructors' title is very important not only for the winner, but also for every single team on the grid and where they finish. At the end of the season, there is a prize fund, and it's distributed based off of where each team finishes in the Constructors' Championship. All teams receive a percentage of that prize fund, but the percentage goes up the higher you finish in the season. So obviously McLaren will receive the highest amount of that fund. However, every position really counts, especially in the midfield, and those 2 points from Fernando Alonso in the sprint race were enough to put Aston over Haas and take that 7th position. Otherwise, I do think it's important that Yuki was able to finish in such a strong position, and that obviously he let Max by very quickly in this race. And the other big consequence looking at this sprint race was it confirmed a little bit of what we already knew, which was that this race was most likely going to be determined by qualifying as well as what happened at the very first turn of the race. At least as long as no one's tire strategy suddenly became a problem. That definitely wasn't what was going to happen. Anyway, let's get into qualifying. Now, heading into qualifying, things did feel a little bit different, but unfortunately, we once again lose Lewis Hamilton in Q1. And I have to be honest with you, I think I would be throwing things if I were him at this point. This season just can't end quickly enough when it comes to Ferrari, and it just continues to be very tough to watch. His teammate Charles Leclerc only makes it into Q2 because they're willing to use extra sets of softs, and I think they literally used every piece of tire allocation for Charles Leclerc to get him all the way to Q3, which obviously felt like a risk when it came to the Grand Prix itself, but at a certain point, you just have to do something. And I guess using every tire allocation you have is at least good enough to get one driver into Q3, but this was just a painful weekend if you're a Lewis Hamilton fan. We also, of course, lose Yuki Tsunoda in Q1, which was tough because personally, I was like really excited to see him having this strong weekend that we started to see in sprint and sprint qualifying, and unfortunately, it just falls away when it comes to qualifying itself for the Grand Prix. We also lose Esteban Ocon, Lance Stroll, and Franco Colapinto in Q1. In Q2, we lose both of the Saubers, Liam Lawson, Ollie Behrman, and Alex Albon. Now, track limits were a problem for Alex a little bit, but I also think we're moving into a portion of this season where we're seeing Carlos get so comfortable with the car that he's starting to outperform Alex consistently, and especially this weekend, this was Carlos's weekend. I do think Williams has to be applauded for the level of performance that they have had this season, and I also think that this is the team to watch when it comes to next year. James Vowles has absolutely brought everything he learned over from Mercedes to building this team into a real team, a real competitor, a real contender, and a situation where I think this season we never would have guessed that Williams was going to have this season looking back at it last year. And I just want to applaud them both for coming so far from that Excel spreadsheet. And in the top 10, we basically essentially see exactly what McLaren thought they needed to go into this race weekend. Oscar is setting himself up for a perfect race weekend, taking pole position for sprint, winning the sprint, and then taking pole position for the Grand Prix. Lando Norris is lined up right behind him, and all he has to do is finish ahead of Max. And then rounding out the top 10, we have George Russell and Kimi Antonelli behind Max, Isaac Hadjar, then Carlos Sainz really popping up into that top 10, Fernando Alonso coming in 8th, and Pierre Gasly in 9th, and then Charles Leclerc just barely making it out to 10th. And so at this point, it honestly feels like it's possible that either Lando Norris takes the championship home in this race weekend, or that Oscar Piastri and Lando manage to knock Max out of contention mathematically, and that they can go into Abu Dhabi really having a final shootout between the two of them. Obviously, that is not what happens in this race. So let's break it down. Heading into the beginning of the race, Max is able to very quickly pick off Lando Norris, which was obviously one of his early goals here. The more clean air you give the McLarens, the bigger gap that they're going to have, the further ahead they get, and the harder it is for Max to catch them in a subpar car. However, Max does do what Max does best, which is racing and genuinely everything, actually. I think Max might just do everything best, but when we look at it, he is able to very quickly get ahead of Lando, and it's some pretty strong driving from him. And at that point, the question is whether or not he could catch Oscar, given that this track, as we saw in the sprint, is not one that has a lot of overtaking opportunities. But remember, these tires can only go 25 laps, and this is a 57-lap race, which brings us to lap 7. At this point, Oscar Piastri has a 2.6-second gap on Max Verstappen. Lando Norris is only 1.7 seconds behind Max, and this is still really a strong race for both McLarens. However, we see contact between Nico Hülkenberg and Pierre Gasly that not only throws debris all over the track, but causes a safety car. Nico Hülkenberg has to retire from the race, and that safety car comes out conveniently 7 laps into a 57-lap race, which, if you can do just basic math, means that if you take this pit stop now, you get a free pit stop and you are able to push directly to that 25-lap and 25-lap point that you have to do with your other remaining tires. And that's what we see almost everyone in the field do, except for the McLarens. Now, there were a couple of things that they could have done. Like everyone else, they could have double stacked the cars and gotten their free pit stop, or they could have brought one car in and split the strategy. Instead, the strategy they went with was to pit 0 cars and go for what they called more flexibility. Now, this is something that both of the drivers were confused about, with Lando specifically saying, why would we not pit if the car ahead is pitting? And essentially what we saw McLaren say is that Red Bull gave up all flexibility for the rest of the race, which seemed very odd in a race situation where there wasn't a real need for flexibility here. Again, this is a racetrack where we saw that qualifying and the first turn were pretty much determining the order in terms of where we would finish the race. Objectively, this race should not have been very exciting. And if you look at the first turn, at the very least, Oscar actually should have won this race. And I think that that is just objectively hands down the truth. Oscar really put in a great performance this weekend, and unfortunately, through no fault of his own, just completely loses everything. And what we then see is that, okay, maybe there's a different tire strategy here. Maybe we're going to see them go to the end of their 25 lap stint with these tires, and then they'll do something interesting. What we see instead is that they go with the exact same tire strategy that Max has, do it 7 laps later, and put themselves back into traffic. And in the way that they ended up pitting these cars, not only does Oscar not get back ahead of Max and not have a real chance to fight him, despite the fact that he was putting up fastest lap after fastest lap, there's just nothing you can do when the gap is 22 seconds because of the pit stop. Lando ends up getting pitted back into traffic in P5, putting himself behind Carlos Sainz and Kimi Antonelli at the end of this race, and in a race where he should have at least ended up on the podium and potentially outscored Max and taken him out of championship contention. Instead, he doesn't end up on the podium at all, and due to a very lucky slip up on Kimi Antonelli's part at the end of this race, ends up in 4th position with a 12-point gap to Max heading into the final round. It's a 16-point gap to Oscar as well, and again, it's another one of those conversations where we're seeing Max benefit from the failure of McLaren, rather than something that he's doing so consistently and spectacular when it comes to the car or the team. I think that this weekend, this tire strategy call and everything that we saw McLaren do is possibly handing Max a 5th title when their drivers literally should never have had a conversation about one of them not winning. Lando or Oscar should have won this drivers' championship, and if they don't do so next weekend, it is absolutely because of calls like this. And it's pretty insane to watch it all play out this way. While I will say that if you ever give a champion like Max Verstappen any kind of breathing room, he's going to take it, I also think there's a difference between leaving a door cracked and leaving it wide open, which is what McLaren has done in the last couple rounds of this championship. It feels like once they won the Constructors' Championship, there was a level of just sort of kind of throwing it up in the air and figuring that everyone's just going to figure it out. But when the mistakes are this big, it is tough to watch when we're talking about a back-to-back Constructors' Championship level team, not being able to make a strategy call that quite literally everyone else in the field made. And of course, we know that Red Bull has always had great strategy when it comes to Hannah Schmidt running the actual strategy team. And this was, of course, a weekend that was won on strategy. But objectively, it's also a race weekend that was lost on strategy, because this was an easy strategy call to make. Outside of the top of the championship, a couple of moments. One, Isaac Hadjar ends up having this devastating puncture after running a pretty good race, ultimately DNFing right at the very end. I was pretty devastated for him, especially given the fact that he had run such a good race. And also, I do think that he and Kimi Antonelli are in this conversation of who's Rookie of the Year. Obviously, the puncture was not his fault, but it is tough, especially because I think he had such a strong beginning to the season, and he's remaining one of the strongest members of this field. And so it sucks at the second to last race, we end up seeing him get this puncture and not be able to finish just literally at the end after running such a strong one. Lewis Hamilton does manage to make up a huge number of positions, finishing 12th and ultimately not making it to the points, but showing that he continues to be able to drive and pass other drivers on track in the way that he always has been able to, but that he does not have the machinery or a team relationship that is working for him in terms of qualifying. Charles Leclerc manages to keep the car in the points and finish 8th, which unfortunately is a strong finish for Ferrari these days, and Liam Lawson ends up finishing ahead of Yuki Tsunoda, finishing 9th with Yuki finishing 10th, but both of them being able to manage to finish in the points, which I think was strong. And then of course, the other two very strong performances are from Carlos Sainz and Kimi Antonelli. Kimi Antonelli, I think, has this ability to drive in a defensive manner that is so strong for such a young driver, and not only such a young driver, but a driver who skipped other levels when it came to getting into Formula One, and who was thrown into a top team with such a large conversation about him replacing Lewis Hamilton, and who's driving against a pretty strong teammate when it comes to George Russell. So getting to see him drive so defensively and so strongly in this race was great. And because of how strong he has been driving this season, it was literally so surprising to see Lando end up catching Kimi and passing him that there were actual conspiracy theories that Kimi had moved out of the way intentionally to let Lando pass. Ultimately, what we did see in the replay is that Kimi Antonelli did have a genuine wobble that made him go wide, and that wide move was just enough for Lando to pass him. Obviously, those 2 points are crucial when it comes to Lando in his fight against Max, but I will be honest, I was shocked to hear GP kind of imply that it was intentional on Kimi's part, because if we're being honest, if Kimi Antonelli was going to be helping anyone on track in this championship fight, I think it would be Max. Their friendship seems to be so genuine, so funny, and so clear, and I don't think I've ever even seen Kimi Antonelli and Lando Norris interact in a positive way, and there's no reason that Mercedes would want to help McLaren. Toto Wolff had some pretty strong words about it as well afterwards, saying that it was absolutely ridiculous to even imply that, and I genuinely do agree. This is one that I don't even think is worth the drama. I think there's no way Kimi Antonelli moved out of Lando's way intentionally. And then we have Carlos Sainz finishing finishing on the podium again in a season where he said he would not be chasing wins or podiums at all. I think it was at the Vegas Grand Prix in the fan zone where a fan actually asked if he was going to apologize for saying that he wasn't going to be fighting for podiums. And he did apologize, and I thank him for it because, in fact, this has been such an incredible second half of the season for Carlos. Not only did he manage to fight for this podium and to win it, but we also saw him take floor damage at the end where he was absolutely just kind of trying to make sure he could maintain this car. And when Lando did pass Kimi Antonelli, there was a real stress that he might also pass Carlos. But I was thrilled to see Carlos hold that podium. And I think it also highlights how important other drivers are to the Drivers' Championship outside of when they fall out of mathematical contention. Every point that one of these drivers who are not Lando, Max, or Oscar take ahead of any of those drivers does heavily affect the Drivers' Championship, as we saw when it comes to the battle between Lando and Max. Lando finishing off of the podium really allows both Max and Oscar to have a window to win this championship next week. And I think the level of possibility here is so exciting. This championship is one that when we started the season out felt like it was going to be wrapped up before the year it was even over. Last year, we wrapped up the championship in Vegas, and that was when Max won his fourth. This year, we're seeing three people that are refusing to go down without a fight, and personally, I find that really exciting. Heading into the final round of this championship, Lando still maintains his lead, but that lead has been cut down to 12 points between him and Max and 16 points between him and Oscar. And so, unfortunately for both Lando and Oscar, there are a number of different scenarios where Max ends up winning his fifth world title. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how these drivers react if that's what happens. Because there has been so much conversation about papaya rules and what's fair and where the drivers are kind of being prioritized, or if either of the drivers are being prioritized at all. And I think it depends on the week, and we see different conversations about it. I do think mathematically looking at it, if we were to lay it all out, Oscar overall does end up with more kind of harm done by the team and team orders than Lando does. But ultimately, either driver losing this championship title to Max really comes down to a lot of the team management. To have the fastest car on the track to such a level that the Constructors' Championship was decided so early, and that the Constructors' Championship point gap is so large, to have your drivers going into the final round of this championship fighting anyone other than each other feels a little bananas to me, to put it mildly. Max is Max, of course, and you should never count him out. But as Max himself said, the only reason that you're not counting him out yet is because of how many mistakes, just like this weekend, we've seen McLaren make. And I think it was fair for Oscar to feel as devastated as he visibly was at the end of this race, because this race was one that was his to lose. And unfortunately, he wasn't the one to make the mistake that caused him to lose it. And at a certain point, I do wonder, I think I've said this a couple of times this season, do Oscar or Lando decide to leave McLaren? Is this the best place for them? And will we know what they're really capable of if they don't leave? Those things, I'm not sure. Maybe we see a very different McLaren and a very different way that they run the team next year. But to me, I think you have two really strong drivers that seem to be consistently frustrated with the decisions that they can't make on track. And it's shocking to have this much of an advantage when it comes to the car and somehow lose that advantage when it comes to your individual title, which is, as a driver, the most important thing to you. Obviously, we've talked about the fact that the Constructors' Championship is where all of the prize money is, and the Drivers' Championship is about bragging rights. But when it comes to a driver's career, the Drivers' Championship is obviously the most important. Nobody really wants to be able to say that they won a bunch of Constructors' Championships, but they never won the individual driver's title themselves. And I think that McLaren is consistently pushing their drivers in that direction. And so it will be interesting to see if both of them decide to stick around for a long-term situation, or if they think that their chances as a driver might be better elsewhere, especially with the 2026 regulations coming in. And so just to wrap things up, I think we have a couple of questions I didn't answer in the full breakdown, so let's jump into your questions, hot takes, and predictions. First question, why do you think the Papayas didn't pit when everyone else did? Great question. I think we're all asking that, even Lando and Oscar themselves, and potentially Zach Brown and Andrea Stella. I think to everyone, generally, I try to point out like, oh, we're not strategists. We don't have all of the data that they have when they're making these decisions. It's a high pressure situation, and everything that I talk about when it comes to strategy is sort of backseat driving, right? However, this is the first time I would genuinely say that everyone else had the same data and made one decision, and McLaren objectively made the wrong decision with no real reasoning as to why. This idea of flexibility, the only thing that made sense was if they were planning to run a soft tire stint and hopefully get much faster in the end of the race, or if they thought that they were going to be blessed with a secondary safety car, which at one point it almost sounded like Oscar was suggesting he bring his own safety car out. But objectively, the right answer on strategy was to double stack all of these cars during the safety car. That's what literally almost everyone else did. That's what everyone else who maintained their position in the race did. And it was a track that you needed that gap. So why didn't they do it? I don't know. Maybe they thought it would be really fun to see what happens at the end if one of their drivers actually ends up losing this driver's title. Maybe someone there is a really big Max Verstappen fan. That is genuinely the only answer that I can come up with for this one. What has to happen in the last race for Max to win? So there are a number of combinations that end with Max winning this championship, but the easiest one to understand is if everything finished exactly the same way as it did today, with Max winning the race and Lando finishing fourth and Oscar finishing second, Max would be a 5-time world champion. Essentially, Max needs to outscore Lando Norris by 12 points, which means that if he wins the race and Lando finishes off of the podium, Max wins the championship. But in any combination where Max outscores Lando by 12 points, Max takes his 5th world title home and potentially buys Andrea Stella a fruit basket. Hot takes and predictions: Max wins his 5th world title on a technicality. I think this is kind of funny because there would be something interesting about that, but also at this point, there's a level of kind of technicality happening already. One thing that I think a lot of us have forgotten is the race in Barcelona and Max literally crashing out. He did literally drive into George Russell and give himself a 10-second penalty, which dropped him all the way down to 10th. And I believe the point spread potentially would have put him only within 1 point of Lando right now if he hadn't done that. That race was obviously a weird one, and there were a couple of strategy calls that were awkward, and Max did address that incident ahead of Qatar, saying that he doesn't believe it would be the reason he lost the championship. But it is wild to think about the fact that if he hadn't been told to swap positions with George, and if he hadn't gotten so angry that he had crashed into George, I think we would literally be in a 1-point title fight going into Abu Dhabi. And again, that's one of those things where it feels insane and definitely a lapse on McLaren's part. But I will say the idea of Max winning because one of the McLarens is disqualified or something along those lines, I will be kind of bummed. I actually think it would be really cool to go into this race and sort of go 3-way head-to-head, see which driver is the best, and really actually finish strong. But that's just me. I do kind of want to see Max standing on the top step of that podium and really look at him winning a 5th world title through a massive amount of fight. Conspiracy theory: McLaren is letting Max win so they don't have to pick a number 1. Objectively, this is funny. And objectively, you know what? No comment, just a good hot take. And of course, there was a lot of love for seeing Hannah Schmidt on the podium with Red Bull. And personally, this is one of my favorite moments of the weekend. Hannah Schmidt is one of the most well-known women in motorsport, and especially in Formula One. I think having a chief strategist who is a woman who is so good at winning, having her up on the podium in Qatar at a race where it was 100% won on a right strategy call, it was a special moment. And seeing her and Max celebrate, I think, is another one of those moments where it does matter. Representation does matter, and seeing women on the podium in this way at this race is important. Watching her celebrate, watching her getting sprayed with champagne, and watching her share a toast with Max, this win was as much hers as Max's, and I really enjoyed watching it. Now we are heading into the final race weekend of the year, and as we know, it is the tightest championship fight that we've had all season. And so I personally am very excited to see, and I'm going to give you my prediction and say that I think Max is actually going to take it. We could eat our words next week and we will see, but it's not an impossible task, and it feels shocking that it isn't. In general, between now and then, be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening. And if you want to head over to my YouTube channel, as well as my TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat, you can see how I spent the race weekend with Aston Martin for Vegas. This was one of the coolest experiences that I've ever had. They gave us so much access. I got to interview drivers. I also got to go into the garage. I spent some time in the viewing gallery during the practice session, and Aston Martin is one of the very unique teams that allows you to film in the garage. So I was able to share a ton of really cool information with you as a viewer. This is a space that obviously not a lot of people get to go into, and I was very privileged to get to go into it, but I was also really grateful that they let me film and be able to share that experience with you. So make sure that you check out that footage whenever you have a chance. And I will see you here next week after Abu Dhabi to talk about whoever wins our 2025 World Drivers' Championship. Until then, be sure to join our Discord server at the link down below and find me on all social media platforms at Marissa Kumari. Thank you so much for spending this season with me, and I will see you next week to go one last round.